let's begin with quick introductions from each of our panelists. So maybe we will start with our owner representative today. So Harlan, if you want to unmute and introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, that'd be great.
Okay, sure. I'm Harlan Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of Project Management and Delivery for the Ministry of Central Services. So we oversee all of the construction projects, the vertical construction projects that are done by executive government, for the ministries that occupy our buildings around the province. So that's my role is to oversee the project management, which includes the consultants and the contractors.
Perfect, thank you, Harlan. Maybe next, let's hear from our insurance guys, starting with John.
Yeah, hello folks, John Spooner, Senior Vice President with Aon in the Saskatoon office, and we are brokers for construction, insurance risk, and contract surety bonding. So happy to be here again today.
Thanks, John. Michael?
It's Mike Sali in the Regina office of Aon. I work with John Spooner. We do insurance and surety for contractors, architects, and engineers in the province.
Thanks, Michael. Next, let's hear from our lawyer, Misty.
Hi, Misty Alexandre. I'm a lawyer with Robertson Stromberg, and I specialize in construction law. So yeah, we've had lots of questions recently just to do with the pandemic issues, as you can imagine. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Misty. Next, let's hear from our architect, James.
I'm James Youck. I'm a principal with P3A in Regina. I'm also the immediate past president of the Saskatchewan Association of Architects, and I sit on the panel as an SAA rep.
Thanks, James. From our general contractor, Mr. Richter.
Thanks, Mark. Cory Richter. I'm the president and CEO of Quorex Construction. So we're a mid-sized general contractor in Saskatchewan. I'm also the past president of the Saskatchewan Construction Association.
Thank you, Cory. And Mr. Hunchak, our trade contractor rep.
Cory Hunchak, president of Clearlite Glass, and past chair of the Provincial Association, as well as past president of the Saskatoon Construction Association.
Thanks, and I'm really only calling them Mr. because they're both named Cory, no other reason. So, okay, so thank you everybody for joining us. Many of you will see Megan's name on the screen. Megan is in as a panelist. She's not participating in the discussion though, and so asked not to be introduced, but she is helping me out to manage all of this. So thank you, Megan, for helping me manage the conversation. Okay, let's dive in with some questions. Again, a reminder to folks, if you've sent in questions ahead of time, we will get to them. And if you want to add questions, you can do so in the Q&A function in Zoom. So let's talk about the pre-bidding phase. So when an owner is still determining what to do. And specifically, I think the question we'd like to start with is, when an owner is determining whether or not to proceed with a project, what factors should they consider? Now, several of the panelists made the point to me that, oh, we don't even want to ask this question because we don't want anybody thinking that they shouldn't proceed with a project. And of course, I know all of us in the construction industry want jobs to go ahead and want projects to continue. But the reality is that there's lots of different considerations that owners have to weigh right now. And COVID being one of them, and the economic impacts of what all of this means for everyone being another. So I think it is an important question because I know people are asking it, and so we're going to go ahead with it. So starting with Harlan, and then I'd like to hear from James, and then maybe open up to some others. When an owner is determining whether or not to proceed with a project, Harlan, what kind of factors should they be considering?
Okay, well, we would consider, or an owner should consider, whether or not a potential interruption of the project is going to be a major factor in the success of the project. So if we were to start working on something and then because of COVID-19 measures or protocols that are put in place during the course of construction, we would have to suspend work or significantly delay some of the work. And that was going to have a major impact on the program or the people who are using the facilities, then we would certainly be very cautious about proceeding. The other factor we consider is cost. If the cost of the measures that need to be taken because of the nature of the site where the work is going to take place. If the costs to operate and operate construction during a pandemic such as COVID-19 are going to make the increase the budget substantially for the project or require a budget increase, then we would also look at possibly deferring that work until such time as the protocols and things can be relaxed somewhat. But certainly from an owner's perspective, as you mentioned, we do want to proceed as much as we can with these projects. So while there may be an incremental cost associated with proceeding now, we also know there is significant capacity in the industry, and the industry is well positioned, I believe, to do the work that needs to be done. The last factor would be regarding safety. If worker safety is not to be compromised, and so if the nature of the work is such that would require workers in close quarters, for example, when social distancing is a requirement, then we would also consider, and this James is next up here, but certainly this would be something that we would consult with our design consultants on, in terms of whether or not we believe the work can be done safely. So we're not putting contractors and bidders in a position where they're attempting to, circumvent some of those protocols.
Thank you, Harlan. James.
Well, Harlan touched on pretty much everything that I would also say. I think there's a little bit of a difference, though, between private owners and public owners, though. I think that the private owners, when they're approaching their projects, just like public, they need to analyze their financial capacity and ensure what we would advise them is that they build in a larger contingency than they may otherwise. So if it means a slightly scaled down scope of work to allow them to carry a little bit larger contingency, that's a good idea. And that also, if they have an extremely tight timeline for whatever reason, be it pre-existing leases or obligations that they have prior to starting a project, we're advising them to go back to their partners or their tenants and renegotiate and establish the go forward point. The nice thing about, if there is a nice thing about the situation we find ourselves in, it's that everybody everywhere is in the same situation. So conversations with corporate clients become much easier when they're experiencing the same hardship. I think with public clients, there's a little different perspective, and the public clients have more of an opportunity to recognize the investment in the infrastructure and how that reflects as a lifeline to many businesses and industries. So if you compare it to an infrastructure project that one of the ministries might do, compared to, say, a private sector client, these are investments in the physical infrastructure of the province, and as opposed to handing out subsidies to businesses, of which we're all part of, where there's really the return on investment is fairly low for government. It means that people are off the public dole, and maybe keeping their jobs. But if they instead take that money and invest it into infrastructure where we keep people employed, it may cost a little bit more, but at the end of the day, the province has that physical asset. So you're going to spend a whole bunch more money in this circumstance regardless. So our advice to our public clients is, doesn't matter, 5%, 10% upcharge, additional risk, take it on, because at some point in time, as the taxpayers, money is coming out of our pockets to subsidize and to support business and individuals in this process. So that's really my perspective on it.
Thanks, James. One of the things I should mention for all of the panelists is, of course, I'm keeping track of questions and things like that. So if anything that anybody else says sparks you to ask a follow-up or to add anything, always feel free just to jump in. And I see Mike Sali has unmuted, so I don't know if you wanted to say something, Mike.
Sure. Yeah. The points of Harlan and James are perfect. The one other thing that probably should be looked at is reviewing the terms of the contract. You know, we know that there's going to be a higher probability of a delay event. And, you know, are the terms of the contract going to adequately and fairly respond to a delay event?
Okay, thank you. Cory Hunchak, you're unmuted. Do you want to say something or are you just unmuted?
I'm just probably unmuted. And,
okay.
But I'd be interested, like we had a large project close yesterday. If Cory Richter has noticed whether there was a substantial increase in pricing from previous jobs. In our scope, I've sourced the pricing, and it's quite actually the contrary. And whether guys are bidding thinking it may be the last job ever to go out, the pricing actually seems to be quite a bit cheaper than previous. So there's potentially that it could go the other way, and there's deals to be had thinking with trades and contractors thinking that the amount of work may be less. I'd like to hopefully think that as long as the owners and the architects keep designing and putting out things for tender, panic pricing and lowballing hopefully won't happen. But in our trade anyway, it didn't seem to. There was no price increases or premiums charged for COVID that I could see.
Cory Richter, anything you want to add to that?
I wouldn't say that we've seen a lot of increases in the prices. I mean, obviously we're having to carry some funds for things that we know that we're going to have to do. But in terms of trade pricing and looking at the project as a whole, I think the numbers are very competitive still. And whether it's just that people just are simply needing more work, or the fact that their fear is that if we don't get the work, then, you know, we could be sitting at home because of this. I'm not sure, but I wouldn't say we've seen a lot of effects. So as an owner, I wouldn't be concerned at all to be bidding. In fact, right now is probably a good time to get your stuff out for tender, because I think you're probably going to get some advantageous pricing out of this, for sure.
Harlan and James, I'd be curious, just from your experience, I don't know if either of you have had any jobs that you've closed in the last month, but if you have, is your experience sort of in line with what the two Corys have said?
Yeah, if I jump in here, I would say that our tenders that we've seen close have closed at or very, very close to where we would have expected pre-COVID. So far the industry is absorbing the supply chain risks, and we're telling owners the same thing, that you know, let's keep things moving. There's lots of opportunity out there. So I agree 100% with what's said.
Harlan?
Yeah, that has been our experience as well. The tenders that we've closed since the state of emergency was declared, we haven't seen significant increases in bid pricing. The pre-tender estimates and bid prices seem to be fairly closely aligned. So we don't seem to be incurring a premium to start work now. But we also have made provisions for sort of COVID-19 response costs in our planning.
Okay, thanks, Harlan. We are seeing some questions come in through the Q&A feature, which is great, and I promise we will get to them. I want to start this next question with Misty, though. Misty, and we'll hear from Aon as well, and likely from Harlan and James on this one. So how does an owner begin to determine the potential COVID-19 impacts in terms of budget and schedule, and what are the things they need to be thinking of here when they're looking at a project, again, in the pre-bidding phase? Misty. Oh, you're muted, Misty.
Glad you told me. I would have gone on for quite some time without that. Again, as far as looking at what your budget is and what your schedule is, you have to address those questions from the outset. My fear right now is that there's a little bit of putting head in the sand. So looking at contract terms and without very, very clear contract terms as to who is bearing what type of risk. I think owners are putting themselves in some jeopardy of dispute down the line. So if you don't address that question right head on at the start of the project, I think there's a possibility of getting into some trouble down the road with delay issues, for example, or with cost overruns. So, I mean, if they're assessing budget issues or they're assessing a schedule, the more transparent you can be at the front end about what risks you consider are properly in the contractor's, ballpark. I think that's one of the best ways you can assess it right now. I'll turn it to John or Michael, but to me, it is about making sure your contracts, you're not relying on just very generalized clauses right now. You are tackling the pandemic issue very specifically.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Misty, in terms of budget impact, you're talking about, or what we would suggest to consider is the total cost of risk increase that is very likely given the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we're talking about there is when you look at the cost of risk, let's even just look at insurance premiums first of all. I mean, they are predicated on the duration of coverage as well as the value of the project, for the most part, on a builder's risk policy. And so you have to consider, well, there's likely going to be a delay, or there could very well be a delay. If not a delay, it's certainly a slower progress, I would think, than a traditional era project. And so you've got that cost consideration of just a longer window of coverage requirement, as well as the potential for the delay. And so that is very likely going to bring in some additional risk costs in and around site security and additional measures that you might not have to employ again in a project that was going to carry on in the regular era. So those are really the things. It's the total cost of risk, the insurance premiums, and the risk management in and around the site that do have to be contemplated, because it's different certainly than it was at this time last year. And those are the things to consider.
Thanks, John. Michael?
Yeah, I would agree with both of you. We're already a month into this pandemic, and there have been so many different scenarios of delay costs and impacts to projects that there are so many examples that we can go back to. I'm sure that the architects of Saskatchewan have run into, the owners of Saskatchewan have run into, and generals have run into. So it's almost asking the questions to other owners and stakeholders of what have impacted your previous projects.
Thanks. Anyone, any other of our panelists want to add anything to the question of how owners can begin to determine the potential impacts of COVID? James, and then Harlan.
I know this is construction focused, but one thing that owners we're telling owners to realize is that the entire design process and production process for us is slower as well. We're not able to collaborate face to face with our consultants. The challenge of coordinating increases. Technology can only take you so far in terms of Zoom or BIM 360 or finding conflicts in Revit, clash detection. So one of the things we're telling our owners is that we are challenged, and it is taking longer. And accelerating things just increases their risk for change orders and delays, and the quality of documents is challenged. Even the design process, if it's a 4-month process, we're telling them to make it 5. That they need to build contingency in at every step of project delivery, given the nature of things. The other thing around risk is I think there's two, and maybe this comes up in some of the later questions, there's 2 pieces here. One is the projects that have been prepared and put out for tender during this pandemic, assuming that the risk of things stays things don't change. For a little while, they were changing daily, but we seem to have settled into a bit of a routine versus projects that were underway. And I agree with Misty that projects that are coming out now, we're recommending to owners that there be language in the front end, the contracts and in the instructions to bidders that specifically says how we will deal with the COVID issue. We've encouraged them to vet that through legal counsel. And that is so that risk is not unduly transferred onto the contractors, that everybody understands exactly how much risk they're expected to take on, and then how you assess that from a business perspective. It's a level playing field is the objective, right? Is to not saddle the construction industry with an undue level of risk. We've had a couple of owners say, let's just pass it on to the contractor. And we've pushed back and said, no, you have to recognize your role in this, in absorbing risk as well as an owner.
Thanks, James. Harlan, I'm going to come to you for a word in a second. Just before I do that, James, you made a point about, you said this is mostly construction focused, and I mean it is, but it's really not at the same time, because there's really that continuum of design and construction, which is really integrated here. And I think it's one of the things I would note is, I think over half of our participants today actually come from the design side. And so we've got a lot of engineers and architects on the line as well. And so I think I would just encourage us all to keep that in mind, and that a lot of the same points apply to both parts of the spectrum. So Harlan.
Yeah, so I would say that as an owner, we need to make sure that our contingency reserves for both schedule and cost need to reflect the risk on the project. And with the pandemic in play, those risks, of course, are higher. So this means we should be carrying a higher contingency reserve on cost than we would ordinarily do, and we should be allowing for more time for some of the activities that need to take place. Certainly, we recognize, even dealing with our clients, the occupants of the buildings that we own, we have a challenge in terms of getting consensus on a design, or getting consensus on a requirement, and then passing that on to the consultant. So we do anticipate that things are going to take longer to develop, and that we may face increased costs post contract award that were not anticipated at the time of contract award. So and I think I think we will get into hopefully later in this call the sort of provisions that we're making in the bidding process to allow for that. But certainly Misty's comments were well taken, that we can't just put our head in the sand and then go ahead with the same documents that we used pre-pandemic.
Well, that's a great segue, Harlan, because I think I want to move in right now into the bidding phase discussion. But before we do that, I just want to give any of our panelists the last opportunity to say anything on the pre-bid. If anybody has anything they want to talk about that. Going once, twice. Okay, well then let's move into the bidding phase. Misty, I think we'll start with you, then Aon, and then Harlan on this one, I think. Should be a straightforward question, but I think there's some nuances here to it as well. Is COVID-19 a known risk now, and what does that mean in terms of shifting liability within the supply chain when bidding?
I know you guys hate when lawyers don't give straight answers, but it really does depend, first of all, on what the terms of the contract say, right? Because that can be very, very different. The pandemic, no question. Everybody knows the pandemic is a thing now, but how that is defined in the contract is again, it's very contract specific. So if you have a contract that says, your permitted costs or additional time for anything that is unknown to the contractor at this time, let's say you don't address the pandemic specifically, you could argue that, I could argue that both ways. You could say, well, that the pandemic exists, so anything and everything that happens from this point forward, you must have accepted. On the flip side, with a general term like that, you could also argue that, well, we know there's restrictions on distancing on the project. We know this, but what if there's a total shutdown of the industry in July? If there's a resurgence of case numbers, does that fit within? Should you have known that? I mean, again, with very general terms, you can argue that either way. So, I mean, if you're bidding on a project, the first thing that you need to do is take a look at the terms of the contract that would deal with any kind of delay or costs and find out how they're worded. Don't be afraid to ask questions during the bidding phase to clarify that. Again, in a perfect world, you would have a contract that specifically sets out, these are the known risks right now. Distancing is a known risk, so you have to work around that. This, but anything other than that could fit within the unknown risk clause. So again, the answer is it depends. Really depends on how it is worded in those contract terms.
Misty, Michael?
Yep, I agree. And if it's such a one-sided clause, how does a contractor bid in an uncapped liability? This is something that could potentially be unlimited. So clarifying, at the RFI stage to cap liability or clarify fairness and relief clauses at tender time will go a long way, because contractors will probably get these questions from their surety companies as well, as what contract are you entering into that the surety is going to provide financial support?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I saw an interesting example of that yesterday in a job that's in the bidding phase that basically put all of the risk on the contractor. And I mean, that's yeah, you as an owner, you're certainly going to get what you may get unintended consequences of that, right? You're not going to get the kind of contractors bidding on that work that are going to understand the risk, and that is going to create further liability later down along the project. Michael, did you want to add something to that?
And you're going to assume that all bidders are reading their contracts before they're bidding. Yes,
that's a big one. John, did you want to add something? And then James?
Yeah, sure, Mark. Just a final thought there, and really it just sums it up. But owners should be cognizant of passing down a lot of risk and making it onerous on contractors, because typically a contractor will be looking for ways to transfer the risk that they are assuming under contract, and they're transferring that risk either through surety or through insurance or risk management of other sorts. But if it's all being rolled down with no regard to how onerous it would be on a contractor, then it makes it tough, because they're in a situation right now where it's becoming more difficult to transfer the risk in some cases with the COVID-19 and as we know, delay costs on those that might not be insurable probably aren't. So just be aware of that. That would be my only comment there, which really has been voiced already. Aware of the onerous nature of the liability transfer to contractors.
Misty, you unmuted. Did you want to say something? Thanks, John.
Yeah, just to add to John's, and again, the other problem with, as I say, putting your head in the sand right now is if owners are taking a position that I want absolutely nothing to do with anything COVID related and anything will be passed down the chain, I think what you're going to get is you're still going to get bids, but you're going to get people looking at contract terms creatively. So again, you're not having that discussion at the outset about who is accepting the risk. You're going to have bids, and then you're going to have disputes down the line about what the terms of the contract say. And it might be fine on paper that you've protected yourself, but that is inevitably, James, you can comment on this, inevitably you're going to have issues on the project if there is something arises COVID related, that either was or wasn't a known risk at the time you bid. I mean, it's going to lead to project disruptions, disputes, and that's the last thing you want. It really is. So just taking the view that I'm not even addressing the issue and I don't want any conditions and pass it all down the chain. I do, again, it's not a bad idea to protect yourself on paper, but it sure is going to be a problem down the road, I think.
James?
Yeah, I agree. This is a really ugly can of worms potentially, and could tie a lot of us up at project end when schedules are extended. I think I responded to a couple of questions, and I think from the flip side of risk, from an owner's perspective, and I've had this conversation with a couple, that they don't want to see COVID become a blank check for the contractors, where contractors aren't doing their job managing the site, maintaining safety on the site, maintaining schedule to the best of their ability. So I think contractors have to put themselves in the owner's shoes as well, and look at it from that perspective. But otherwise, I completely agree. I think that you've got to be upfront about how the risk. We're telling owners to be upfront about how to be clear on the risk, and to try to make it as clear as we can in the documents. Risk is part of everything that we all do in our industry, regardless, and we're all making business decisions as to how much we're going to take on. I mean, pre-COVID, we can all probably think of owners who, and people sometimes think it's the consultants, and more often than not, it's the owners that are asking us to put clauses into contracts and front-end documents that are onerous and pass a lot of risk to the contractors. And we all have the choice, even in tough times, to decide if we're going to bid on them and what we're going to bid. And we've seen projects where owners have put an unreasonable amount of risk onto the contractors, and in a hungry market, they've gotten 1 or 2 bids. A clear message. So, I think we still have an opportunity, and we do the same thing as architects and engineers. When RFPs come out and there are onerous clauses contractually, we make that decision, and quite often we won't chase projects because they're too onerous.
Thanks, James. Harlan, I want to hear from you on this, since James was blaming it all on the owners. But no, coming back again to the question of sort of the known risk component, and I'd like you to, in addition to answering the question, if you can share a little bit about what you guys are doing, I think that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. Certainly, we need to be concerned about sort of the foreseeable risk versus the unforeseeable risk, and so what the approach that we're taking is to try to minimize the unforeseeable risk related to changing public health orders, changing the environment in which contractors need to work, because nobody, us included, even though we're the government, we don't know what might happen and what sort of provisions may be added. So we're in our bidding documents, we're going to attempt as much as we can to separate those two and include and basically go to tender with the conditions that exist today. So whatever provisions the prime contractor would need to take under the current health orders and the current occupational health and safety standards, we want them to include in their bid price. And we're also looking at providing for uniformity in the bidding process, providing sort of an expiry date on those conditions, so that bidders know that everybody is bidding on these conditions continuing for the next 6 months, rather than because bidders sometimes will bid a longer schedule or a shorter schedule, and we need to make sure that we're covering off, that we're bidding on a level playing field on a consistent basis. So we would include whatever provisions need to be taken now in terms of maintaining a safe site, and we are not prescribing what those conditions are. That is the prime contractor's responsibility to determine those things, and we are using the current situation as the basis for bidding, and then we are the approach that we plan to take is to have the successful bidder provide us with some detail around the provisions that they have included in their base bid, so that we have a baseline against which to compare future changes in those public health orders or the regulatory environment. So that way there's less I guess negotiation, or less potential for dispute around real costs that contractors will incur if the regulations and the requirements become more stringent, and there's also less potential for dispute if those protocols become relaxed, because we now have an itemized list of those additional costs. So that's our current approach, and we're building that into our tender documents, our construction bidding documents. And I guess we're certainly interested in feedback on that approach.
Thanks, Harlan. Okay, so I want to spend about another 10, 15 minutes at most in this section, and then we'll spend the rest of our time in the after award phase of the discussion. We had a bunch of questions that came in pre town hall related to this phase, and some questions in the Q&A box. So I'd like to move through those. I don't have these assigned to anybody, so if you want to comment on them, just unmute. This first one came from George from Stantec, who said, has CCDC provided any additional bulletins regarding COVID-19 that anyone is aware of? I'm not aware of any, but I'm not sure. I'm seeing shaking heads. Okay, nothing that anybody's aware of. Okay, sorry, George, no news there, but we'll see what we can see from them hopefully in the future. This next question came from Dustin from AODBT. Should the general conditions be revised to account for COVID, or do the current GCs cover the delays and potential claims? Who'd like to comment on that? Misty, and then Cory.
You know, again, just if you're saying the current general conditions, again, I would ask which general conditions, right? Everybody has, you know, there's some owners have their own form of contracts that they like to use every time. There's the CCDC ones. There's a number of them. You know, again, I've seen I'll refer to the CCDC ones. I've seen the CCDC terms, and it's true they have some that would be, I would say, directly applicable, like the stop work. You know, if there's a stop work order by a public authority, you know, again, I would say yes, that's bang on if there is a stop work. But where you get into trouble with the you know, the standard CCDC terms is when they talk about anything that is beyond the contractor's control, right? That is such a wide open statement. So if you have, maybe your industry has no stop work order, but one of the key manufacturers does. You know, maybe you can still get product, but now it's at an inflated price. You know, there's a number of things that you can't account for. So I would certainly, I would recommend, if you have a CCDC, I would recommend revising it right now so that you do have some specific risks that are put in place. So it's clear, anything to do with distancing on the project is a known risk that is in the contractor's ball. You know, so I mean, again, fleshing it out, I wouldn't rely on a straight CCDC right now. I would probably go further with sub-conditions.
Thanks, Misty. Cory Richter, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think Misty did a good job of covering it off. So I'm not sure there's much more I could add, but yeah, right now, the CCDC, I think the only provision you have today is you can actually terminate your contract if the project was to be stopped, which really isn't a good provision. So I like Harlan's approach where we're identifying what some of the known risks are today, putting a timeline around that, and then at least you're working as a partnership through that. And to me, I think that's the best approach.
Thanks, Mr. Richter. Anybody else want to add anything to that? Yeah, Cory, Hunchak, and then Harlan.
Well, no one wants to see projects terminated for sure. If there's a pause, then I would think that it needs to get addressed at that level. If there's like a stop work for an indefinite amount of time, owners, I would hope, would be receptive to say, okay, that's a cost that the contractor shouldn't have to incur. They're not going to want contractors to pad their pricing based on this. The competitive nature of the industry probably isn't going to, anyone who's padding their price to prevent themselves from liability probably isn't going to get the job. So I would think that that's not going to be the case for on a lot of projects. But supply chains, everyone needs to take their own risk, and for contractors who start on the job site right away, obviously the risk is higher. We'd hope that 6 months down the road, things are loosened back and things get to a little bit more sense of normalcy. But we don't know that. Nobody has a crystal ball. So potentially, like, you don't want to have people padding their price to get the work and hope that they can litigate. The only ones that have an advantage on when that goes to is the lawyers in the house. So, and Misty will be happy. She's dropping a bunch of cards right now. So, but it needs to be addressed, and everyone needs to take their own risk and see. But stop work is the biggest concern as far as my concern as a trade contractor. There's no advantage to it. Slow down work. Well, that's you can mitigate that. Basically, a stop work order and construction ceasing is the major concern in my world anyway.
Thanks, Cory. I want to hear from Harlan on the question of sort of the general conditions and delays and potential claims there. And to Cory Hunchak's point, we may not have a crystal ball, but I do have one of these magic 8 balls, and so that may give us the answers we need. Harlan.
Good. I regularly refer to my magic 8 ball. So yeah, we have not made a significant changes to our general conditions of contract. But we are providing, I guess, means of addressing the COVID-19 or pandemic potential delays and increased costs as part of the bidding documents, which get incorporated into our contract. So the other thing I will mention is that for existing contracts, we have issued a letter to all existing contractors identifying that we've taken the step that we've assumed a notice of delay has been provided by all contractors effective the date the state of emergency was declared. The extent of the delay is to be evaluated, and this also relates to reasonable costs in terms of the changes to the cost of the work. So we're taking the approach that this was unforeseeable in terms of a pandemic for contracts that were entered into prior to the pandemic being declared. So we are entertaining, I guess, and we'll look at reasonable evidence-supported costs. We are also going to be looking for contractors to identify additional supports that may be available to them. As a means of offsetting those costs. So if there's federal funding available for wage loss, that sort of thing, then we would want to consider that. We'd want to be able to consider that in terms of any increases to the contract value that result from COVID-19.
Mark, you're on mute.
Jeepers. Yeah, that doesn't happen very often. Okay, thank you. I was prattling on. Okay, I have 5 more questions I want to get through here in this section. Cory Richter and Cory Hunchak, just so you know, in the Q&A box, there is a question from Jason Marquardt, but I'm going to come to you guys in a few minutes to ask you to answer. And James and Harlan, there's one from Brad Cornum that I'm going to come to you in a few minutes to ask you to answer as well, just so you can think about that. But I want to go back to a few of the questions that we received ahead of time. This one came from Kurt Dietrich. Is there a policy in place for electronic receipt of bids? So I guess that will be very dependent on the owner themselves, right? But who would like to comment on that? Michael, John, or anybody want to start us off on that one?
Yeah, we're seeing that a lot of the bid acceptable bids are either a scanned version of a bid security bond, a bid bond for bid security, or an electronic digital bond. There's a subtle difference between the two. But we are seeing that owners are being fairly flexible in their acceptance of bid documents at this time, and we're trying to comply with the transmission form of what's expected. We can issue them in any possible means, including the old hard delivery of a paper copy. But we appreciate the owners giving us some flexibility so that we can support the contractors. Therefore,
Michael, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, agree with John there. I think there was a question as well with e-tendering of how do you confirm receipt of some of these documents, and that's a really tricky one when you're sending large files to owners. And in the very few e-tendering instances we've come across over the past few years, usually there's the owner or the consultant will provide a confirmation of delivery receipt, or the bidder will follow up for receipt that it was submitted and fully received. But to John's point, you know, there are owners accepting PDF copies of bonds. That does expose the owner because they're not valid documents. They're non-original bonds, and there are ways of getting around that besides originals. Like John said, there's certain you know, e-tendering providers. I think we've seen Integrity Infinite Source, that's based out of BC, and we're seeing it City of Swift Current, City of Meadow Lake. I think Cory Richter, you probably just bid something recently through that system. There's different ways around it, but you know, you should be a little cautious of a PDF copy unless you're 100% fully aware of who the bidder is. You know, it's not a legal document. And hopefully this is kind of a catalyst for our archaic surety industry to change physically embossed documents that need to be original to go the route of digitally sealed documents, which have been around for the last couple of years, where very few owners like Defense Construction Canada and City of Calgary are some of the very few owners that actually accept these.
Thanks, Michael. Harlan, I'm curious, come back to you in a second, John, but Harlan, so there was the two questions, which I guess we'll sort of tackle together. So Kurt's question of, is there a policy in place for electronic receipt of bids? And Sean McLeod from Catterall and Wright asked, how can we provide clarity on submission receipt time, because lag in email transmission can be an issue. So can you talk a little bit about how you guys handle that?
Sure. Yeah, we are now only accepting electronic bids. We had consultations with a representative of the surety industry, and they've indicated that the surety industry is ready and able to provide e-bonding. So we are asking for e-bonding as part of our bids. So contractors who intend to bid on our projects should be at least making contact with their surety at this time and saying, you know, how do I get this e-bonding in place? I was assured that there's not a huge onerous process for contractors to acquire the ability to submit an e-bond. We are asking for bids to be in a password protected PDF file. Because we typically do a public opening, and we want to make sure that the bids are sealed until that time. So we will ask the contractor or the bidder to send us a PDF that is password protected for password on open. And then after the closing time, within a half-hour closing time, we will either contact the bidder, or the bidder will contact us and provide the password, so that then we can maintain the integrity of the sealed bid process. So that's the approach that we plan to take. You know, in terms of bids, we do issue an electronic receipt when the bid comes in to confirm that we have received the bid. We're accepting e-bonds, and we've got a process in place that will allow bidders to provide us with a sealed bid and a password, so that we can unseal that after the time has elapsed for the bidding period.
Okay, thanks. Misty, did you want to add something to that? Or John first, though, because I think you did.
Sure, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I just wanted to add, Mike's comments were extremely valid on the legality of the bonds, that the scanned version of a bond is, you know, I believe not considered to be a legal document, whereas the digital e-bond, because it's got a verifiable signature embedded, is a valid bond. And of course, the old hard copy with ink signature and an embossed seal is valid. But I just wanted to encourage owners, whether it's the Central Services or others, in this time of transition and understanding, owners and consultants to not, you know, consider disqualifying a bid only because it looks like the bid bond is a scanned version or something that wouldn't quite meet the original standards of a legal document, because we are working through it. There's a lot of contractors, mid and small contractors, that are trying to wrap their heads around it. Harlan's correct. The process isn't all that, it's not onerous and it's not that long, but there's just some misunderstanding around the document. So I would suggest that if you do get a scanned copy of a bond, if you've accepted it, that's great. You can verify it, you know, in other means, say by a phone call or eventual provision of a hard copy bond. That's just my 2 bits on that one, is that to have some leniency in and around the documentation of the bond at this time, until everything kind of works through to everybody getting onto e-bonds, for example.
Thanks, John. Misty, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just when you were asking whether there's any kind of policy, you know, not really a policy, but a good place to start for any owners who are looking at electronic acceptance of bids. Take a look at the CCDC 23, I believe it is. It is a guide document for bidding and tendering, and it does address, it has a specific section on some guidelines that they recommend for electronic bids. You know, one of the biggest ones that is again, becomes a legal issue is making sure that you're very clear what time it is received and at where, you know, so that it's not so much that it's a bid that you've got, you know, you have confirmation of acceptance or of receipt, but it's at the other end, right? So you have to be very clear on whose time clock you are relying upon, right? You know, and to address the question of what happens when you have an overload of things coming through the system, it's not a lot different than the era of just handing bids in. I mean, you know, again, a stupid example is if you have a date and time for delivery of a hard copy sealed bid, you know, what happens if there's no elevators to get you to the 12th floor? I mean, it's on the bidder to make sure that they get it across the finish line by a particular time. But that being said, you know, you as owners, obviously you got to have your IT people ready to go, because you know, if you say that you're going to accept them and your entire system goes down, now you've got some problems. Now you got to start digging into what your rights and obligations are. So there's definitely some tricky aspects to electronic bidding, but I think you can mitigate it as much as possible if you look at that CCDC document and try to address all of those questions when you are setting out your you know, your tender documents from the outset.
Thanks, Misty. I do know earlier on we'd had a question from Rabindra from the city of Moose Jaw around how do we work with bonds. So Rabindra, I'm not sure if the discussion around e-bonds here helped address that or not. If not, please feel free to post a further clarification on your question and we can get an answer to it. Next, I'd like to move to the question that was asked by Jason Marquardt. So we'll start with the Corys on this one. How should trade and general contractor bids allow for COVID-19 on new products? As an example, you know, variable price alternates or things like that. COVID-19 has increased costs, labor, and schedule on current projects due to special measures, but it is unknown how long this is going to continue, and competitors don't necessarily seem to be pricing this in, right? So most companies can't afford to interrupt cash flow by missing out on the few projects that are out in the market. So yeah, how do you allow for COVID on new projects in your bidding? And maybe we'll start with you, Cory Richter.
Thanks, Mark. You know, the easy answer is I don't know. You know, I think that's the biggest thing we're all struggling with right now.
That was my answer.
Well, it's a difficult question. You know, I think the biggest challenge right now is there is some knowns today. You know, we do know today that we're having to do additional cleaning. You know, we know that some of the out of town projects, we have to add more vehicles, maybe more hotel rooms, those kind of things, more toilets. But the issue is we don't know for how long, right? So it's, you know, and I guess the way I've looked at it a little bit is that, you know, in construction, we take risk. I mean, we bid projects where we know that it's going to rain and we know that it's going to snow, but we don't know if it's going to rain 1 inch or 100 inches. And we don't know if it's going to snow for a day or for 6 months. So, you know, I think the only thing that we can do at this point is we have to account for the known risks that are out there today, and we have to do it in a reasonable manner, right? I mean, you can let your mind wander and you could allow for this thing for the next 2 years, but do we really think it's going to be that long? I mean, I don't know. I guess it's a real difficult question to ask. So, you know, I think really for most contractors, the biggest thing that you have to start allowing for is you do know there's some costs. So trying to associate some of those costs and putting together that when you're submitting your bids. I think that's the biggest things you can do. The scary part about this, and we've talked a little bit about this already, is there's a lot of contracts on projects that are being tendered that don't address this. So then there's a lot of questions around, what happens if we get shut down, or what happens when 6 months from now I need a specialty tile from Italy that they no longer produce. I don't have an answer to those questions, because I don't think any of us have an answer to those. So I think for the owners and our consulting group, as long as we're all working on this together, we'll figure it out and we'll get through it. And there will be costs. Some of those costs will have to be borne by the projects. And there might be other things that come along down the road that we have to address. So, it's a real difficult question to answer, because we really just don't know. I think that's the biggest concern today. So I don't know if that helps you, but that's kind of how we're approaching it.
Thanks, Cory. Mr. Hunchak?
Well, Cory's exactly right as far as it's totally unknown how long and what the cost implication is. We're incurring costs daily, and whether it was buying respirators or getting snow removal, it's a risk that you need to incorporate. And what risk are you, as a trade or a general contractor, are you willing to do or to take on? Unfortunately, in a competitive bid market, the more risk you take on and add to it, you're taking the chance of your competitor not doing that. Communication is going to be key with the owners, with the design community, with the general contractors, and work continuing to come out on a regular basis is going to be key to stop panic bidding and basically people thinking that this is going to be the last project that's going to come out for tender ever. That happens all the time. COVID hasn't changed that. Somebody comes out, the first job in January is always a smoking deal, because everyone thinks there's nothing else going to come out. So keeping the chain going and keeping tendering coming is going to help mitigate panic pricing, is going to help people absorb the risk or be able to allow risk. If there's one job that comes out for tender once a month, COVID or not, restrictions or not, the price is going to be extremely low, and it's going to be a fight all the way through, because people are going to bid it low and then litigate. So the only way we're going to get through this as an industry is and be strong on the other side. Everyone's going to get through it, but our industry being strong on the other side is what we need. And basically, communication continued. Total shutdown is the worst case scenario for the economy, for the industry, for cash flows, for contractors. We need to make sure that the system, whether it's going slower, is still going. So build in your risks for what you're comfortable with. Hopefully you'll figure out and get a handle for where the market is at. And hopefully there continues to be enough work out there that people start not panic pricing and not panic bidding. So that's all I got.
Thanks, Cory. I'd actually like to flip that question around a little bit to James and to Harlan, and ask how that, looking at whether or not people have appropriately priced that in, and how is the current situation with the risk of COVID, has that changed the way in which you're evaluating submissions that you're seeing at all? Has it changed what you're looking for in terms of those submissions and how you're evaluating? I'm just curious about that. Maybe James first and then Harlan.
Damn it, I was hoping Harlan would go first. I answered a question in the chat here too on that, and we are seeing qualifications to bids. and things that we would normally never entertain. You know, tossing a bid because it's got qualifications would be, I think, more in line. I think we're being forced to take a little bit of a different perspective and go back to the contractors and try to get more information and better quantify the qualification. And so and unfortunately, that's kind of where we're at with projects that were at the point of tender when all of the uncertainty started. This session today is helping me as well understand where we need to beef up some of the supplementary conditions and add some wording to the contract so that it is clear who's taking on the risk and how much we expect. But it's a really tough one to answer. I'd say qualifications are what we're seeing, and we're dealing with it on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, James. Harlan, and I guess, yeah, that was the question that Brad Cornham had asked that you had answered, and for some reason it looks like it kicked it back out when our internet glitched. But so just asking that, Harlan, is, you know, are the tender submissions you're seeing submitted by general contractors now including qualifications? And if so, how are you handling these, and are they being accepted?
Well, we haven't seen any qualifications yet that I'm aware of. But one thing that I would strongly encourage bidders on our projects and everyone else's projects is take advantage of the time period for questions, because if it is uncertain as to what basis you are to use in putting your bid together in terms of future potential events and that type of thing, it's you know, as an owner, I want to make sure that I'm getting competitive bids, and I'm not just ending up with you know, sort of the race to the bottom with a bidder that is going to have to cut corners in order to stay in business as a result of winning the contract. But you know, we want to ensure that our bid documents are clear and provide clear direction as to what bidders should be including and what they should not. So if it isn't clear in the tender that we put out as to, you know, how do we address this potential risk, or are we responsible for this risk, or is this something that that the owner is taking on, then hold us to account for that. And I'm sure James would echo this sentiment that, you know, we want our bid documents to be as clear and concise as possible so that we get good competitive bids on our project. So, you know, and we, as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to take steps to identify that up front in our bid documents, specifically related to the response to the pandemic. But this, you know, holds true of any unknown risk on any project. If you don't know, or it isn't clear from the documents how you are to address that in your bid, then please ask those questions.
Thanks, Harlan. Misty, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just to add a comment to that. You know, as far as are you getting qualifications on bids, you know, just a reminder, I know everything else in the world has changed in the last 3 to 4 weeks, but competitive bid law has not. You know, so if you are submitting conditional bids or bids that have, you know, alternate pricing or anything like that, you're still only allowed to do that if the bid documents permit that. You know, so if the rules of the tender say we will accept on this, or you can provide qualifications, you know, I mean, again, an RFP sometimes is a little bit wider where you can do things like that, but the competitive bid law is still the same. So if you are submitting a bid and you know, you're not allowed, if they just want a base price and you're throwing in alternates or you're throwing in ifs and buts, again, there's a good chance you are submitting a conditional or qualified bid, and in most circumstances that will result in a rejection. You know, and again, I know there is some out there that I've heard that are taking the risk and saying, well, I still want a bid and I really want them to see my price, but I have to give myself an out. It's no different than it was a year ago. If you do that, you are at risk of having your bid rejected. And if your bid is accepted, you are at risk of having a challenge. So it's a huge risk for the owner to accept it. and it's a huge risk for the contractor to have their bid rejected. So, you know, again, just keep that in mind. And that's why, Harlan, great comment. You know, if you have questions, that the time to do it is by, you know, using the RFI process. Make sure you're submitting that and addressing it ahead of time.
It's Misty. James?
Yeah, I should, you're exactly right, Misty. I should qualify my comment that the case-by-case basis is where we've used an RFP process as opposed to a traditional process.
Cory Richter, there was a second part of Brad's question, which is we're starting to see more and more subcontractors qualify their bids submitted to GCs. How's the industry handling this? So do you just want to comment on that from your perspective?
Yeah, that must be just a Graham problem. We haven't had any issues with that. So yeah, so you know, in all seriousness, sorry, just when you got the mic, you got to take the chance, right? We were talking to contractors ahead of time, and we're trying to encourage them not to qualify their tenders, because the biggest concern that we have is on the projects where we're not permitted to provide a qualification. It puts us in a bad spot. So there might be times that we just can't use a quote from a subtrade because of that very issue. You know, Mark, the other thing, if I can, I'd like to back up to the e-bidding for a second. Can I do that?
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
Okay. So I want to soften the comments around e-bidding, because the thing that we all need to remember is a lot of our staff are working from home, right? So they're using internet connections that are not to the same quality as what we have in our offices. So, you know, as a general contractor, we're submitting bids, you know, 2 and 3 minutes before the close. You know, I think there is a very high possibility that some of those bids get stuck in the train between the sender and the receiver. So I want to encourage everyone to keep that in mind. You know, I would hate to see a contractor's bid not get accepted because it's 30 seconds late because it got stuck in the chain. I assume that wouldn't be the case, but just something to keep in mind.
Michael, it looks like you want to say something to that, no? Okay, sorry, I thought you were unmuting. Okay, thanks, Cory. Okay, let's dive into the last part of the discussion here, which is projects that have already been awarded. We're going to go an extra 5 minutes because of the internet glitch we had here, and we're at the office and we had an internet problem. So anyway, there were some questions from folks here on this phase. So first, from Rabindra from the city of Moose Jaw, and James or Harlan, I'll look to you first on this one. So this comes from the owner perspective. How do we supervise the construction work executed by a contractor right now? So how does COVID-19 change the way in which we may have to supervise the construction work being executed by contractors? Whoever wants to go first. Harlan, do you want to go first this time? Sure,
okay. Yeah, I guess we're not seeing a big difference in how we supervise the work, other than we have to, you know, we still have to abide by the prime contractor's rules for the site. So the prime contractor does get to say, these are the precautions that need to be put in place. This is the screening form we want you to fill out, or whatever the case may be. But in terms of supervising the work, it does make a bit of difference in terms of the process to validate the progress, because we have to maintain social distancing in order to do that. So often it means consultants and project managers taking separate views of the work that's been completed in order to ensure that it's been completed according to the contract documents. But we're not seeing a major difference, other than there's probably less, certainly a lot less group visits to site to look at the progress, and it often presents challenges in terms of questions coming back to the consultant in terms of interpretation of the contract documents and the designs and specifications as to, you know, how do we address this given this existing condition. So we do a lot more now with remote access, like we'll have them send photograph rather than going out and looking at it ourselves. We're looking at video evidence as well as a possibility. So it hasn't. We certainly haven't made any adjustments to the contract documents in terms of how or whether or not we can oversee that work.
Okay, James.
I won't repeat everything that Harlan said. I agree entirely. That's exactly what we're seeing. To push it a little bit further, we're making sure that everybody that is going to site understands that COVID is it's a site safety issue. We're not there to endanger workers on the site or anything like that. So it's imperative that our people follow the rules that are set in place by the contractor. On top of that, we've layered in our own OH&S around site visits, more so than specifically to COVID, and that's that we're not doing site visits in groups, as Harlan said, but we're actually mandating that to our staff that when they go and do a site review, they're to be doing that with the site superintendent or the foreman, and they're to be social distancing as they move around the site. We're asking them to make sure that they're changing their clothes when they get home and wash their hands. And if they were coming back to the office, we're completely remote right now, but we would be asking them to do the same. So and we're not permitting our staff to attend site meetings. Site meetings have to be virtual. And the only other thing that I would add to Harlan's comment about video and photographs is we're being very specific with what we want to see from the contractors in terms of video, and we're actually not seeing a lot of video, but photographs. And there is a warning for consultants in terms of managing your liability risk. You don't want someone on site taking a photograph of a entire wall, 50-foot wall where there's a problem with a little 1.5-inch square someplace. The liability that becomes part of the project record, and if there was a problem somewhere else in that photo, the assumption in an insurance claim would be, well, you had a photograph of it, why didn't you see that other problem that was going on? And we're all busy, and you quite likely wouldn't be looking at anything other than what your attention was drawn to by the contractor's question or what you were looking for. So we set out some parameters for what photographs we'll actually review and what becomes part of the project record to help protect ourselves. It's no different than what you would tell your people doing site reviews to photograph and to be cautious of when they're on site.
Thanks, James. Cory Richter, you're unmuted. Do you want to say something, or?
Yeah, I mean, what we've been doing is, we understand that our consultants still need to visit the sites, and pictures are not always the best way to communicate that. So in a lot of cases, we're just scheduling visits, and we're doing those on off hours so that, when the consultants are coming, there might be 1 or 2 of them that come, but they're the only ones on the site, in addition to our superintendent, so that we're minimizing the amount of traffic and just keeping that safe for everyone. And that seems to be working fine for the most part.
Okay, thanks. I want to talk about projects that were awarded pre-COVID. And so this is, we'll say, before the middle of March. So thinking about a project like that was awarded pre-COVID, what are the major challenges that are facing companies in the supply chain for these projects? So if you can just talk about it from your perspective, or for what you're hearing from your clients, what are the major challenges for projects awarded pre-COVID? And I think, John Spooner, I'm going to put you on the spot and start with you.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so, the projects that are underway and that were set up at the terms pre-COVID, the consideration here and the problem from the supply chain, and I'm using that term generally to include things like risk coverage insurance. The problem is that it becomes a material change from what the underwriters have expected the risk to be prior to the COVID-19. And that is that the COVID-19 has created a delay and perhaps an abandonment or an idle position on the project work that's going on. And so the challenge is on that the risk profile has changed. And so what do you do with that? Well, the challenge then becomes one of communication to your insurance channels through the supply chain back through your broker as to what's going on with significant detail. And the challenge then becomes one of physical protection in and around the site and the requirements that your insurer might impose on that, because again, it's different than it was when they underwrote it originally. And the challenge becomes one of the costs associated with the delay itself. If in fact there is a delay. So our costs higher in almost every area, including risk costs. And, so those are the things that I would see. It's this material change that changes the profile of the risk. It's the challenge in and around communicating that. It's the challenge in and around meeting conditions that are now in place because of that. And it's the costs associated with the delay itself.
Thanks, John. Michael, do you want to add anything to that from what John said?
No, that's fine. John said it best.
Okay, Misty, what are you hearing? Oh, you're muted again, Misty.
Yeah, as mentioned, material supply is an issue. Lots of, again, notice of delay issues. One of the big concerns is, we're not experiencing a delay now, but we anticipate maybe we might down the road because of COVID. So there's a lot of questions around, do we give a notice of delay? And again, we've talked about that in the previous town halls. It's not a bad idea to give a notice now, but also make sure you're giving a notice at the time an actual delay is experienced. And again, that's kind of covering your bases both ways. Well, some of the big issues right now are dealing with the project timelines and whether that's going to push you into winter work or things like that. So, I think that's some of the issues that are being encountered by everybody right now. The best situations are when, if it's mid-project, when the contractor and the owner are having a sit down and having open communication. So much is resolved by just addressing the issue head on now, as opposed to saying, well, we'll just see what happens. We'll just see what happens. That just makes everybody who's on the project nervous going forward, and it makes you overly cautious. And in my view, it's not a great way to continue proceeding down that road, right? So yeah, I think the past town halls have addressed it pretty well as far as what we're hearing.
Thanks. Maybe we'll go to Cory Hunchak next. Cory, from the perspective of trade contractors, what are the biggest challenges for projects that were awarded pre-COVID?
Well, obviously the production slowdown, like everybody, allows for a certain amount of time loss and a certain amount of items that they need to purchase. This is obviously over and above what could ever have been anticipated 8 months ago on jobs that we have. Whether they're just the communication lines just have to stay open. We have a current job in Regina that is a healthcare facility that has been suspended because it's a renovation, and obviously we don't want to expose our workers to what's there, and they don't want to expose their patients to our workers. So that needs to be dealt with, and on that basis, on that one, we manufacture our own products, so we have a bit of an extended liability to say, well, if I've got $200,000 worth of material sitting in my shop, the contract says I can't bill for it until I put it on the job site. So if the health region basically suspends that project for 8 months, and God forbid the general contractor says, well, no, I'm out, and terminates our contract, I have a $200,000 liability sitting in my shop, that nothing to say that who takes over the job is going to hire me back to to complete the job. So that's things like that need to be addressed. And obviously, if the lines of communications are open, and we'll talk to the contractor, and the contractor will talk to the owner, and I'm sure a reasonable, I'm hoping a reasonable resolution could be had, whether it's delivering materials to site, whether it's saying, well, I'll store your material here or in a bonded warehouse. But obviously costs are going to be incurred and need to be addressed. So on this instance, we're hoping that we just store the materials here, and we make sure that whatever documentation that the owner wants and the architect wants for to make sure that their material is here and safe needs to be complied. So yeah, as long as we communicate and everybody is in this together, and I'm sure reasonable solutions can be arranged to come up with the difficult decisions that need to be addressed when they arise. So when we do get into the situation where someone's going to go and say, well, you agreed to comply to this schedule. Well, no one foresaw COVID-19. In those instances, you got to make sure that's okay. Well, I can't imagine any sort of legal recourse could be taken, saying, well, you signed a contract that said you'd be done by July. Well, we've lost 20% productivity, and we can't put 20 guys on a job site. So I would think that cooler heads will prevail at the end of the day, and a reasonable solution will come across on each one. And there again, as long as everyone realizes we're all in this together and we're all have the same goal, and at the end of the day to finish a project and build it, and everyone hopefully make money at the end of the day. We'll be better on the other end. So.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you, Cory. Cory Richter, from the perspective of GCs, what are the major challenges that you're facing for projects that were awarded pre-COVID?
There's been a lot of things that we've had to deal with in the last number of weeks, things that we never in my wildest dreams would have had to deal with. Obviously the first fear was, is it safe for our staff to continue working? We needed to figure that out very quickly, because we did not want to put staff in a position where they're at risk. Then we needed to, move forward with all the new provisions in terms of what the health authority has issued. Obviously buying sanitizer and cleaning supplies and things are in a high demand, and they're not readily available. So that was another challenge we had to deal with. Once you get your staff set up and they're able to work safely, we worked on a number of safety policies, and we purposely held on to those because things were changing so fast in that first 2 weeks that we just didn't feel confident that we could issue something that we could have people rely on. So, we were issuing best practices and telling our staff, these are the things that we want you to do, but we didn't actually put those into a policy right away. So, once you get that sort of thing figured out, obviously the contractual part of it is a major concern. We issued delay notices on all of our projects, and those notices were open-ended because we really don't know what this means. We don't know if it just means a little bit of extra cleaning and a few extra costs for the next little while. Some of our sub-trades experienced widespread crew drops where they had guys that were sick. Thankfully, none of them were sick with COVID, but what's happening is people were getting the flu, which happens normally, and we're taking things to the second level in terms of making sure they're safe and making sure that they're not coming back and infecting others. So, so we've had to deal with those kind of things. Trying to reassure our trades and our owners and our own staff that we can continue working. The government has told us we're the industry that is one of the most safe in terms of keeping people active. That's been a good thing, but that's been a challenge. A lot of our staff have said, well, why has everybody else been sent home, but we're allowed to keep working? And in the first few weeks, that was a major challenge because we had a lot of staff that just said, I can't be at work. This is not safe for me. And they went home. thankfully, most of those staff came back because they realized that, look, we're an industry that takes safety to a different level. We had all sorts of safety policies and procedures that we added into place, and we shared those with all of our trades to make sure that we were, not only keeping ourselves safe, but trying to educate our industry as best we can. And, and I think one of the things that I've always found that was really helpful for me was I'm talking to my competitors, finding out, what are you guys doing? How are you dealing with this? What are the challenges that you're facing? Those things are helping us learn to be a lot more educated in terms of what are the next steps. What comes tomorrow will be different than what comes today. And so we've, I think we've done a good job in terms of keeping all the projects running. We did have some projects that got shut down. Mostly those were healthcare projects, and for obvious reasons, anything to do with healthcare has just immediately been stopped. And we respect that. We wouldn't want to be compromising those facilities when, when this is going on. So we don't know what it means on those jobs. Those are, they basically call them an indefinite hold. So they haven't canceled the job, they've just put it on hold. So there's still some big steps ahead of us. We obviously haven't figured out what this is going to cost, and then trying to get reimbursed for that. We're going to try and treat our owners as fairly as we can, but we're going to have a lot of costs that are not normal, and trying to explain those to our consultants and to our owners so that we can get something that's a fair settlement. That's a big step that we haven't touched yet. And that probably is the one that's the most concerning on top of the safety related things, because our trades are asking that same question. Well, am I going to get paid for extra vehicles or extra cleaning or whatever the extra things that they're going to have to do? And we're saying, well, we think so and we hope so, but until we get to that step, it's just not a good feeling. And I guess the thing I always go back to is I try to approach it from a reasonable situation to say, look, we're all in this together, whether I'm a trade contractor, a general, an owner, or a consultant. So as long as calmer heads prevail and we work through this as a team, we're going to get through this, and we should all come out the other end probably stronger than we are today. So.
Thanks, Cory. We're going to go to Harlan next, then James. We're going to take one more question after that. I will say for those questions, we didn't get to one from Nathan from Stantec, from Ryan from Associated Engineering. Kurt has one in the Q&A, and there's a couple of anonymous ones. We will get responses after the fact and send those out, except for the anonymous ones, because we don't know who sent them. So if you want to send your questions in by email to me, you can. And we will get those back to you. But I'd like to hear from Harlan and then James on the perspective of pre-COVID projects that were awarded pre-COVID. What are the major challenges that you've seen so far? Harlan first.
I guess the biggest thing is the unknowns, of course. And during the early stages of the COVID-19 response, things were changing daily. And so it was unclear to contractors, consultants, as well as to us as an owner, what provisions were required to be put in place, what were recommended to be put in place, and were there things that the contractors were going to do to ensure the safety of their workers or the building occupants or the general public that went beyond what was required, and what sort of reasonable approach do we take in terms of those potential additional costs and delays. And as we started out this process in terms of what would the owner consider before actually proceeding with the project, there's certainly that consideration was given with COVID-19 to whether we should be suspending work on projects or whether we should be carrying on with the work. And it did depend on the project itself as to what the terms were. We were, for example, in correctional centers, we were asked to suspend all. They wanted to suspend all outside visitors, including contractors, going into the work sites. So for a certain amount of time, we had suspended work. we expect to get a bill for that because we are in fact causing a delay in that situation, and it was not by public health directive. It was because of the occupants of the building. So those kinds of challenges we've had to weather through, and I think the best approach that we've been able to take is to make sure that we're communicating what we know when we know it to everyone on the team, and then working through those issues together.
Thank you, Harlan. James.
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer. I think that the whole situation is a strain on relationships across the board, and it's just definitely a strain on consultant and contractor relationships. But I think we're in an enviable position in our market where there are some good relationships. And you sort of have to leverage those. I know we've had discussions with owners where sort of, you go from the contractual to the moral issues at hand pretty quickly, and what's appropriate, and what would we expect our neighbor and our kids' hockey coach to take on for risk, and how would we deal with them, knowing that in many cases owners are not one-off in our province. They're long-term owners and builders are the same. The contracting industry is the same. So yeah, we're leaning on those relationships pretty heavy. I think existing projects we're going to see some delay claims, and as I noted in a question response, that I think it really behooves contractors to be very careful about assembling those, make sure they have their ducks in a row and their documentation properly prepared, and are able to present a very fair and reasonable case to the owner as to where things were when COVID happened and the measures were put in place, and demonstrate that the issues with delays and costs started at that point, so that owners have a strong comfort level that this isn't a bearing of other poorly coordinated or poorly managed job site issues into the COVID crisis that we've got.
Thank you, James. I see that Michael wanted to answer a question live from Ryan King. So why don't we go to that question?
Sorry, that was a mistake. Apologize, pressed the wrong button.
Oh, okay, no problem. Well, then Ryan, we will get back to you with an answer to your question after the fact. So I'd like to close with one final question. I'd like to hear from everyone. Obviously, since we are running late, I'll ask you to keep your comments relatively short. But I think this is an important one, and we heard several of the people in their last answers touch on this a little bit. How should the various companies within the supply chain approach one another in having these discussions? So, because we're dealing with additional costs and delays that nobody really planned for, and we have to be compliant with COVID-19 protocols. Assuming that we're dealing with a situation like that, and you've got additional costs and delays, no matter where you're at in the supply chain, how do you begin to have conversations about this, knowing that everybody is feeling the same kind of pressures and in the same kind of boat? We won't go in any particular order, so anybody who'd like to tackle that first, I'd encourage you to do that, and I'll quickly go around the horn. Mr. Richter, go ahead, and then Cory Hunchak.
Sure. I think the biggest thing is we have to be honest and open with each other. And we have to realize that this is not an opportunity to cash in on a project that maybe you missed something. There is going to be some costs, and we just have to be honest. We have to be honest with each other. We have to communicate, and we have to be patient, because it's going to take time for this to get resolved. I think those are the easiest recommendations that I could give someone.
Thanks, Cory.
Yeah, I think Cory hit the nail on the head there. Misty, cover your ears. Worst case scenario is this all goes legal, and it's contracts thrown in your face and saying this is what the contract says. I hope that through communication and open dialogue that all levels of the supply chain can get through what we're going to be up for in the next 6-8 months. Who knows how long this is going to take? But with open dialogue and communication, and there again, like there's going to be bad apples in this, and saying, "Oh, I'm going to cash in. These delays are costing me tens of thousands of dollars," and trying to pass it down the line. I would hope that because we are all in this together and the whole world's involved in this, we're not isolated in the situation. So as long as we can be open and honest and that dialogue can happen, I think that realistic numbers can be ascertained by, or that's what this is costing, and as long as the GCs, the sub trades, the suppliers, the consultants, the owners see an open dialogue and it being transparent, I don't see this being this can go one of two ways. It can go very badly and it goes all legal, or it can go smoothly and say, okay, let's come up with a reasonable solution and go from there.
Thanks, Cory. So when things go bad, they go legal, Misty. What are your thoughts on?
I mean, I don't necessarily see it as bad, you know. The biggest issue right now is tackling the problem and looking at it too far reaching, right? So you have owners saying, I don't want everything from this point forward to be COVID related, you know, so we're scared to death of taking on any COVID related risk. Contractors on the other sense, you know, it's not a great conversation starter to say everything that's related to COVID this point forward, I don't want any risk for whatsoever. And you tend to have a very isolated conversation. But the more specific you can be, the better it is for both parties. You know, Cory brought up a good point earlier about estimating rain delays. And you know, again, some of the best projects are the ones where you have a pre-anticipated number of rain days, and thereafter, that's when you get into additional costs. So the parties know exactly what they're getting into. So, I mean, a great conversation starter is to really dive into what exactly is the known risk. So, you know, if you say, I don't know how to bid on a project because I don't know how many COVID days we will have of distancing and can't drive in the same vehicle, have a conversation about that. Put it right into the bid documents or the contract, saying you can estimate a blank number of days of this madness going on. And thereafter, the risk is transferred. So if it's more than that, additional costs are awarded. If it's, you know, again, you build it in. So I would say, yeah, the more you can have specific conversations as opposed to just saying, you're taking all the COVID risk or I'm taking all the COVID risk, I think you'll have a lot better discussion. So, you know, again, the front end conversations, you know, much as lawyers love digging in, the front end conversations are so much more important than having that conversation down the road if you haven't addressed it.
Thanks, Misty. Michael, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yep. I agree with everybody's points, and as proactive as all parties can be to a potential delay or cost implications, the better. To James's point, document and verify your costs and try and mitigate any potential lost or additional costs. If the contractors haven't seen the Rive and Associates document, that is a great document to lay out exactly how you should be documenting a delay or a claim cost. And to the owners or consultants that are delivering these projects, if you haven't seen Harlan Central Services notification or the City of Winnipeg COVID-19 schedule delays that they put in their contracts, it's a they're both very well written documents.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. I was just going to put in chat that we're going to circulate those documents to everybody, but I see Megan's already done that. Although, Megan, you sent it to the panelists. So if you can circulate it to the attendees as well, that would be great. So we'll circulate 3 documents, the Rive document, the Central Services notice that Harlan had sent out, and the City of Winnipeg information as well. And we'll either get that to you right now in the chat, or we'll also include it in the video of this that goes out later. Thanks, Michael. John.
Yeah, just a couple of things to add to the great comments already. I agree with Cory Richter at the start that there has to be an honesty. Numbers on the page really help to lay it down, say, hey, here's what we're looking at, guys and gals, and let's see what the costs really are here. But then I might add, and I don't know if I'm being overly optimistic, but if you have an existing contract in place, a lot of times that can be a guide. But my thought on that is, in the clauses that might come to play, if there's a force majeure, if there's unknown circumstances clauses, my hope would be that those could be read and interpreted with a leniency that may not have been taken previously in the vein of negotiation. So look at those clauses, say, okay, what do we have in the contract that can assist us as we work through this, and use a lenient interpretation maybe to achieve a negotiated arrangement for the parties involved.
Thanks, John. James, do you want to go next? Just again, the perspective of what parties can do to collaborate and to discuss these issues and challenges.
I don't know that I've got a whole lot to add, Mark, other than that, to reiterate the importance of dialogue around it, and encouraging contractors when there is a contract or a tender that comes out that isn't addressing this very well in your mind, to notify the consultant, be direct with your question and suggestions. Don't just tell the architect or the engineer that the tender documents aren't fair or the contract isn't fair. Following Misty's commentary, just be really specific about it, and think about us as an intermediary, and what tools you can provide us with, so that we can go and advocate on the industry's behalf with owners, understanding that we're trying to represent what's best for projects, and not simply for one side or the other.
Thanks, James. And the last word goes to you, Harlan.
Okay, so yeah, well, I guess as an owner that's been around as long as the province, maybe not me personally, but but it's getting close. It feels like that. It's you know, we do take a long-term view, and we recognize that that you know, we need to ensure that we're cultivating a healthy industry. So healthy in terms of healthy financially, as well as healthy from a physical health perspective. So something that I've often said is that and I borrowed this from someone, and I can't remember who, but you can't build a successful business on the backs of unsuccessful suppliers. And I think that's where as an owner, we need to recognize, and we do recognize that we're all in this COVID-19 pandemic together, and we are. It is in everybody's interest to come to a reasonable assessment of the impact of this on all of us, and work to try to minimize that. Anytime I see a situation where we're pushing all of the risk onto one of our partners, it ends up coming back to cost us more. You know, I think that's been my experience anyway. Maybe not in the short term, and that's where, you know, there can be a win-lose scenario that you know, I'm going to push this on to somebody else and then I win. But you know, I think everybody on this call, and probably everybody that's logged in, is in business for a longer term than just the next contract. And so that's I guess that would be my take on that. And I think everyone does benefit when we take a reasonable approach.
Perfect. Thank you, Harlan. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thanks to all of our participants for your patience as we ran a little long today. There were lots of great questions and good dialogue. A reminder that this has been recorded and will be available. Likely it'll be sent out in our bulletin and available on YouTube later today. So you'll be able to see it or pass it on to others. Any documents that or resources that were referenced will be included in that as well. So it'll be available to everybody. And the questions that were asked but not answered will be provided as well, although those may not be ready until tomorrow. Thanks everybody for your time. Thanks so much to our panelists for your time and engagement. Really appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day. Stay safe and take care.